Hello, I am Lucy Baldwin, and I want to make a video today talking about an idea that I've been contemplating, working, writing about. And it's something that I'm calling spiritual fractalization. And it's also very much about sort of holding the polarity of perspective as we do self transformational work. So let me explain. Um, Early on in my sort of spiritual journey, I was exposed to the idea of spiritual bypass. And I immediately, upon hearing the words, knew what it was referring to and knew that I was doing it and wanted to stop. And I went on to read a wonderful book called Spiritual Bypassing by Robert Masters, and I actually went and did some work with him. And he's an amazing psychotherapist, and I really love what he says about spiritual bypassing. I think it's a really important topic. What I have only recently, in the last 6 or 8 months, have started to recognize is that in my sort of humans do this thing, which you probably have noticed, which is that we tend to jump from one extreme to the other. And I see this in academia when I was in college. I see this in almost every field that I was in, too, because I went deeply into a couple different fields and I saw it in every field was this sort of like very extreme arguments happening on two sort of like opposing sides of something, and there were very few voices in the middle, just sort of being like, what if it's something sort of in between? And then obviously we see it in politics in a major way, and we see it in everywhere with humans. So we like to sort of jump from one extreme to the other, and this has definitely been, I think it was sort of what I did with the spiritual bypassing is I sort of went to this other extreme of feeling the need to just keep digging and digging and digging into like my problems sort of. So it created this, I guess, internal atmosphere of feeling very of needing to constantly dig into every little thing and problematizing things, and sort of like, well, like the term spiritual fractalization, sort of fractalizing myself. So a fractal is a pattern that repeats on every level. So it's sort of like you zoom in and you get back to that same thing, and you zoom in and it looks, and it kind of, it keeps, like, you just keep going down, but it's showing you sort of the same thing. Um, so just like zooming in and in and in and just like digging deeper and deeper and deeper to the point where it's actually not helpful anymore, because there's the everything is becoming sort of like everything now needs to be like deeply investigated and deeply acknowledged, um, and there obviously are things that do need to be deeply acknowledged, and there are certain things that we need to sort of identify and then work on. But there's sort of this weird thing that happens. So there's a couple different like pieces to this whole like this whole spiritual fractalization thing. One of them is this sort of this need to sort of like obsess and dwell in one's problems, which actually can, even going even deeper, can lead to a person identifying with their problems and sort of being defined by, like, us choosing to define ourselves by our problems, because we're putting all the attention and all the focus on our problems. Another element of this is sort of this this feeling, this sense, this like dedication to doing this work forever. And the way that that sort of comes out, and I've had so many of these conversations with people, and since I've started noticing this and really like put a name on it, and started to like dig deeper into my own experience with it, I now see it everywhere in my community, in languaging like, there's always more work to do. There's always more, like, this is a never ending sort of like path, it's this journey of like like there's always going to be more things that we can uncover and like find these little like it's like we're mining for problems in ourselves. And there's a couple things about that. I think for me, my major problem with that is that we're telling ourselves on some level, we're telling ourselves that we're never going to be good enough. And as I become more self-actualized, I am noticing that that belief is sort of has been holding me back, because there's sort of like this idea of enlightenment that's over here, and it's sort of on a pedestal, and it's sort of considered like untouchable, like we're not going to get there because like that's way beyond us. um and then there's like what we're actually supposed to be doing is apparently just like constantly finding like what is our problem now. And I've noticed that like people will ask me how I am, and I'm like, I'm amazing, and it's like they don't believe me. They're like, but like what are you working on, like what is coming up for you right now? And I'm like, I'm actually just like in a really great place, and I'm not saying that's going to last forever, but there's sort of this like attitude where you're not allowed to just like be good. You're not allowed to feel like, wow, I've really transmuted the things in my life that I really wanted to, and now I feel like I can sort of like move on to the next stage of my life, and maybe like do a little bit less of the like intense internal transformational work. That sort of like thinking that is not really allowed. And I used to feel that way. Like if somebody would say that they were, I mean, I was in, as you know, if you listen to my podcast, very much involved with like the ayahuasca. And I used to think like if somebody was like stepping away from the medicine or anything like that, and I believed that it was because they were, not willing to show up and not willing to do the work, and like they must have like problems. And there was like there were all these stories about it. Like you're not allowed to just like stop doing this work. um and I'm not saying that. So, yeah, which is just to say that that whole like mindset and attitude is part of this spiritual fractalization um where we're just like obsessively digging and digging and digging and like needing to have a problem to solve. So like if there isn't a problem, so this is like the other part of it, the third part, which is that if there isn't a problem, then we're creating one. So just to keep ourselves having like something to work on, something to dig into, something to process, something to obsess over. And the ultimate outcome of this is that, I mean, first of all, I feel like this can actually really deeply inhibit personal transformation. I also feel like it leads to very, sort of like a very narcissistic outlook, because we're putting our problems on a pedestal, and we're sort of obsessing over our problems, and and needing to constantly like, have support and be acknowledged. And it also leads to, I would say, like premature boundaries with people, because we're just there's sort of like this way in which, when you're sort of in this spiritual fractalization, you're not able to sort of get perspective and look at things from other people's sides, or just kind of like have that broader awareness. So that's just sort of an introduction to what this idea of spiritual fractalization is. And it feels very very much like the opposite of spiritual bypass, where you're just sort of ignoring, you're trying to, bypass your problems, you're trying to ignore your problems and basically just sort of like dissociate from feeling the hard feelings. So instead of doing that, you're like obsessing over the problems. So these are sort of what I see as the two poles is just being like, oh, everything is perfect, everything's amazing, like everything, everything is part of God's great plan and we're all connected and it's all perfect. And versus this sort of like hyper focusing and really dwelling in our problem and problematizing every little thing, every negative emotion. And um, so, for me, it feels like I feel like actually having both of those perspectives can actually be really helpful and important as long as we're able to hold somewhat of a center. And it might be that we, kind of like do this, or I think that there's also something that happens where people can sort of like jump back and forth from the extremes, but like really holding the center is to me feels like healthy um and also just like really deeply, profoundly, like, powerful spirituality, like, self-transformation, sort of like space to be in, where we're not afraid to look at our problems, we're not afraid to, like, feel what we need to feel, but we also don't need to, like, create our whole identity around that. And then but also being able to recognize sort of like the bigger perspective of things. And to some sense, like spiritual bypass is sort of like you're zooming out too far, like you're trying to kind of like bypass the human experience. And spiritual fractalization is like you're only hyper focusing on the self. And so being able to recognize both of those perspectives, but holding sort of a more central, like, okay, I am my own organism and I'm also part of like this big universe. And, I'm a piece of God or whatever it is that you believe. So being able to hold both of those and just um, look at both of those angles with any in any given moment, with any particular like problem that comes up, with any decision that you're making. So yeah, I guess that's really what I wanted to talk about. And I hope that that was clear and that you are following me. It's sort of funny for like, I guess kind of what's happened to me is I've started to meet and interact with more and more people who are like kind of sort of enlightened to some degree. And it's sort of helped me shed this belief that I was carrying of like, that's never going to happen. That's not really what I'm here for. Because I'm recognizing that there are sort of like different levels of like altered states of consciousness that that we do have access to, and it's not necessarily bypass to to be able to sort of like experience an altered state of consciousness where you feel love and connection with all things. um, and I think there's a lot of people who might want to say that it is, and that that's okay, that's up to them. But just sort of as I progress and as I sort of like become more in tune with my own truth, I'm just sort of recognizing these ways of thinking that aren't actually serving me. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about it. And it's funny because even when I was sort of studying spiritual bypassing, I was still hearing teachers and great people talking about how we're all already enlightened to some degree and how we have access to this. And and I feel like it's just it's not wrong to take that perspective, and I don't think it's wrong to sort of believe that we can get there. And of course we want to do it in a way that's grounded, and um we want to be like actually we don't want to be skipping steps, I guess, because that's just going to come back to bite us. And if we do, then that happens and then we'll deal with it and it's okay. But yeah, I just feel like there's a lot of potential in recognizing sort of like where, being able to even just check in with myself, like, okay, am I bypassing here? Am I like where am I at with this? Like what kind of thinking am I doing right now? And is it actually is it serving me? Is it helping me? Is this am I lying to myself? Am I like obsessing over things that I don't need to obsess over? Just like holding that awareness. So thank you so much for watching my video. If you've made it this far, thank you. I appreciate it. Please, subscribe to my channel, like the video, comment what your thoughts are, even if you hate it. I'm definitely curious for feedback and input because these are sort of still new ideas that I'm playing with, and I want to understand how you all think about them because I only have my own experience to go off of, and I've definitely done a lot of like both of these things. So, thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.